Hello everyone, and welcome to the Complete Bio 181 Lab Fern Germination video, where I'm going to be going over how to grow a maidenhair fern all the way from little baby spores to a complete and total full-grown adult fern. Pretty much this entire lab was up to me gaining a bunch of different websites and picking a god and praying and putting those things together and hoping that all of that care and time and information would result in some very pretty looking ferns, and I am very proud to say that it worked. So let's move on to the setup I used in the lab to put this life cycle into motion. The experimental process began by us acquiring petri dishes. For the sake of this lab, we did not start in soil, and instead we used small petri dishes with about a 1/4 inch thick of agar in them. With an L-shaped rod, we gently moved around our spore drops to distribute them evenly across the dish, just to make sure that all of them had an even amount of space to grow and they weren't all clustered where we put the drops. Once this was complete, we simply took our dishes over, put a little bit of deionized water on them to keep them nice and moist, and put them in a designated corner of the lab under a grow light. Once these steps were complete, it was up to us, the individual students, to come up with specific care plans for the ferns. And then, given my newfound borderline obsession to make these little things grow, given how unique they are, I decided to take things to the next level. May I introduce to you all, the Ferninator. The Ferninator, which yes, sounds a lot like a contraption Dr. Doofenshmirtz would create, is a relatively simple design that is actually not my own. I graciously took the idea from a website called Sea Fern Web Manual, which had instruction on how to grow ferns from spores in a lab with a handmade setup, which sounded like a complete goldmine to me when I stumbled across it. With all of these factors combined, I had miraculously created the perfect incubator for fern spores that would hopefully result in some very pretty looking ferns. Now, it was time to wait. Once the Ferninator setup was complete and the ferns were nice and cozy inside, over the course of 7 weeks, I recorded average temperatures, average humidity, times that the ferns had been watered per week, and progress pictures to track their growth and conditions. I did this not only to track my data, but also to see which conditions yielded the best growth. I'll be displaying the average temperatures, humidities, watering frequency, and time frame here and here as we go through weeks of growth. For week 1, we barely saw any growth. Much to my dismay, it was very, very stressful. I didn't quite panic yet, as I knew that the spores weren't supposed to show much growth for a couple of weeks yet, but that didn't stop me from worrying whatsoever. The average temperature the first week was a lot higher than I wanted it to be, especially the first day when it hit 99 degrees on the inside, since I accidentally let them sit in the sun in the morning, which basically turned the incubator into an oven. Week 2 was thankfully much more eventful, as we finally got to see some small flecks of green. There was barely really anything there, you really have to strain your eyes to look for it, but it's green and it's growth, so I was happy. Week 3 is when it really got serious. I remember lifting up the cover of the Ferninator at the beginning of the week and seeing little tiny gametophyte looking plants, and there had to have been hundreds of them across all 4 dishes that I was working with, and I almost dropped the box. I was so excited. The leaf-like structures that I saw, and which you see here, are gametophytes and the first portion of the fern's life cycle, as we mentioned earlier, which will eventually give way to sporophytes as time goes on. At this point, I changed the watering frequency to just make sure that the ferns were in some level of constant water. It was really less about moisture and more about having them submerged in water so that they could hopefully successfully fertilize one another. Week 4 was much of the same in terms of looks, but I was able to get some really cool pictures of some rhizoid growth into the agar layer. It's cool, right? This was the week that I ended up taking the ferns home for spring break, so unfortunately they weren't in the optimal setup that they were in the lab, and because they were downstairs in my basement, they ended up getting a little bit cooler, but overall I don't think it really got in the way of their growth all that much. As for week 5, I was once again met with an extremely pleasant surprise: spore fights! The itty-bitty sprouts you see here in the red circles are indeed sporophytes, which is what all mature ferns are, but in its infancy stage. So it doesn't really look like much of anything, but trust me, this is extremely promising. Since the ferns were getting a little bit too big for their dishes, I decided to contact a botanist friend of mine down at the college to help me make some fern soil that I could transport the sporophytes into so that they could get a little bit more room to grow. We met at the beginning of week 6 and made a soil mix containing of 2 parts peat moss and 1 part sand, with the other part consisting of a small amount of homemade compost. At the bottom of our soil layer as well, we added a small layer of pebbles just so that there could be enough drainage in there so that it wouldn't really get waterlogged. To transport the young ferns, I gently cut out chunks of agar that held the most sporophytes and gametophytes, lending extreme caution around the developing roots that were wound together in the agar to make sure I didn't accidentally slice them in half. Once I had multiple pieces of agar and sporophytes cut out, I made a very small indent in the dirt with my finger, just enough to where I could place the little piece of agar with the sporophytes gently into the soil, and also very gently covered up the outsides of the agar that wasn't covered in anything green with soil. Once all my pots were looking pretty darn snazzy with little green dots all over them, I removed the cardboard stand from the ferninator box and inserted all of the pots into the ferninator. Once the ferns were back in the ferninator and in their respective fern soil, they continued to grow and gained beautiful, vibrant, light green colors over the course of the next couple weeks, which we could very well tell was probably from the extra nutrients that we got from the soil. Given that the soil is made of mostly peat moss, it holds on to a ridiculous amount of moisture, making the average humidity in there as high as 99% pretty much constantly. Since week 6, the ferns have continued to develop their fronds and grow a little bit taller each day. I decided to cut off the growth process at week 7, giving the timing of recording and the editing process, and quite honestly, the due date of this video for Bio 181 Lab. So just imagine that the rest of the fern babies that I showed in the pictures previously will grow into large, luscious ferns, as I am guessing that they will. And that's just about all I have. I hope you guys found the video to be educational in some means if you're trying to grow your own ferns at home, specifically maidenhairs, or have simply enjoyed this short video essay about some obsessed college student growing ferns and going way above and beyond what she needed to. Anyhow, thank you so much for watching and taking the time to watch my process from spore to adult, and I hope you guys have a great day. Keep it green. Bye-bye!